glorious morning to one and all present here. Here are our fellow mates to perform an act on the triumph of surgery. I am Suma, the narrator.
I am Likansha as Mrs. Pumphrey.
And I'm Sajid, I'm acting as Tricky.
I am Akshay, I am acting as Mr. Harriet. What happened to Tricky? I was really worried about Tricky this time. He became like a bloated sausage. His eyes are bloodshot.
Mrs. Pumphrey hesitated, but then she said,
He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. I thought he was suffering from malnutrition. That is the only reason I gave him a little extra between the meals.
Did you cut down the sweet things as I suggested you?
Yeah, I did, but he liked sweet things, cream, cakes a lot that I can't refuse him.
This was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He would never refuse the food and he would take meal all over the day and night.
Are you giving him plenty of exercise?
Yes, Mr. Harriet, he goes on little walks with me.
I sound serious. If you don't cut down the food and keep him on a strict diet, he'll fall ill.
Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hand and said,
Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right. I will do it.
Few days later, the unexpected call came within a few days from Mrs. Pumphrey. She started complaining about the behavior of Tricky.
Hello, Mr. Harriet.
Hello.
Tricky is not eating anything, even his favorite things. He spent all his day lying on the rug.
I suggest that Tricky should be hospitalized for a fortnight.
Mrs. Pumphrey almost swooned. She was sure Tricky would die and pine without seeing her every day. But the Mr. Harriot took a fine line and through his was the best to do for Tricky. Mr. Harriot carried away Tricky while the entire staff rushed for taking the belongings of Tricky. Mr. Pumphrey was with a despairing cry and everybody were in tears. At the surgery, Tricky was left motionless on the carpet. All dogs sniffed, felt that it is an uninteresting object and ignored. Mr. Harriot made a bed for Tricky where other dogs slept. He only gave water to Tricky but no food. After 2 days, he started showing some interest among his surroundings. All the day while Mrs. Pumphrey ringed Mr. Harriot and asked,
Hello, Mr. Harriet.
Hello.
Is Tricky fine? Is he eating? Is he healthy?
Yes, Tricky is getting recovered rapidly.
Mrs. Pumphrey then started sending eggs, wine, and brandy for him, but nothing were given to Tricky. Everything was enjoyed by Mr. Harriot and his staff. Within a few days, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived at Mr. Harriot's place. He went in. A mass of dogs were hunting round and round, and in the middle was the little Tricky. He had been transformed into a hard-muzzled animal. When Mr. Harriot brought him to the gate, Tricky jumped down into the laps of Mrs. Pumphrey. Mr. Harriot helped to bring out Tricky's stuff, but none of them were used. While leaving from Mr. Harriot's place, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned from the car window and said, Mr. Harriot, this is the triumph of surgery.
The irony of this story is the doctor understands the cause and remedy of the dog and treats the dog right away without any surgery. The moral of the story is to live and love the way in a balanced way.
Thank you.
Thank you.